Welcome to Language Access Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the crucial role of language access in public services and businesses. I am your host, Carol Velandia, and I invite you to join me on a journey of discovery and empowerment. Language access is not just a matter of convenience. It is a fundamental human right and the key that unlocks doors to essential services and opportunities. In this podcast, we'll explore the far-reaching impact of language access, examining how it shapes not only healthcare, justice, and education, but also the world of business. Through thought-provoking interviews, insightful discussions, and compelling stories, we will unveil the power of language access. We will hear from professionals who bridge communication gaps to provide quality care for diverse communities. We will explore the intersection of language, law, and justice, and the crucial role that interpreters and translators play in ensuring fair and equitable treatment. We will delve into the challenges and innovations as well as how language access opens doors to effective communication and inclusion and how it makes our society more equitable. But our exploration doesn't stop there. We will also uncover the profound impact of language access in the world of business. We will hear from entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and experts who understand the value of inclusive and effective communication and how it drives success in today's global marketplace. Language Access Matters is your platform to understand the significance of language access in these vital sectors of society. We will shed light on the barriers faced by individuals and communities and the innovative solutions that promote inclusion and equality. Whether you are a healthcare professional, a legal expert, an educator, a business owner, a linguist, an advocate, or simply passionate about the power of language, this podcast is for you. Together, we will navigate the challenges, celebrate the victories, and advocate for a world where language access truly matters. So, join me on this enlightening journey as we uncover the impact of language access in healthcare, justice, education, and businesses. Let's amplify the voices of the 25 million people that don't speak English in the United States and those that don't speak the dominant language around the world. Those voices deserve to be heard and empowered, and we need to empower ourselves to build a more inclusive future. Welcome to Language Access Matters. Let's embark on this transformative exploration together. Good afternoon, everybody. Language access is often framed as a technical fix. Add interpreters here, translate a few forms, check the compliance box. Our podcast is pushing against that narrow view by asking how language access can become a cultural, structural, and imaginative shift. One that changes how institutions see communities, how communities see themselves, and how power is shared. Our guest today, Olivia Mignone. Dr. Olivia Mignone is a sociolinguist specializing in linguistic landscapes, migration, and language policy, with a focus on how minoritized communities navigate and reshape multilingual cities. Her dissertation, Vital Signs, Tibetan in the Linguistic Landscape of Jackson Heights, uses geosemiotic analysis, which I'm going to ask her to define in a little bit, interviews and photographic documentation to show how Tibetan language and script functions as living symbols of identity, religion, and belonging in a dense multilingual neighborhood of Queens, New York. By unpacking how diversity is often framed through a consumerist lens, her research argues for needs-based, community-driven language access policies that increase the visibility and legitimacy of minoritized languages, especially for refugee communities. Olivia's work is innovative because it treats the linguistic landscape, signs, scripts, posters, storefronts, religious texts,
and other public displays as a real-time diagnostic of who is seen, who is served, and who is structurally ignored in policy making. In showing how Tibetan is simultaneously a spiritual symbol, an ethnic marker, and a tool for everyday navigation, she demonstrates that language access is not only about interpreters and translated documents, but also about whose languages inhabit streets, institutions, and public life. By critiquing neoliberal diversity narratives that commodify culture without meeting communities' concrete linguistic needs, her research offers an evidence base for recentering language access on rights, safety, and participation. For language access advocates, social workers, and interpreters, this perspective helps connect everyday struggles like a lack of signage in certain languages or the erasure of refugee languages in multicultural branding to broader policy structures that can be challenged and designed. Welcome, Dr. Mignon. It's a pleasure to have you here. I've been wanting to have you in my podcast for some time, and I'm delighted that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Carol.
Yes. So on this podcast, we're trying to move language access from just a simple checklist to really a cultural shift. That has been a dream of mine for several years now. When I was introduced to your research, I wanted to ask you, so when you look at the Tibetan linguistic landscape in Jackson Heights, what did you see that helped you reimagine that what true language access could look like? What was your inspiration?
Thank you. Yeah. So I was drawn to do research in Jackson Heights because it's such a testament to linguistic diversity. And it certainly has that reputation of being one of the most linguistically diverse neighborhoods, not just in New York City, but in probably the world. We're one of the most linguistically diverse neighborhoods in the world. You have languages spoken there that represent corners of the world as far apart as the Indian subcontinent, Central and South America, but spoken by people who are living side by side with one another as neighbors in a small space or a small location. And all of these languages from all over the world are highly visible in the neighborhood, but they have a limited amount of space to share. So the population that I focused on for my dissertation research, and one population that Jackson Heights is notable for, is its Tibetan population. And this community and their language stood out to me because it's not one of the biggest, and their language is relatively smaller compared to larger minoritized language groups. And yet the Tibetan community has really made their language super visible in everyday life, from shop signs, religious spaces, flyers, restaurants, and community centers. And despite this, there remains a space where Tibetan is nearly invisible, despite the large neighborhood presence, and that's within official services. There's this notable absence of Tibetan, even within hospitals, government offices, transit signage in the neighborhood where there is a sizable Tibetan population. So the community, they were doing this work on their own, basically, of preserving language on their own, while institutions were kind of lagging behind. So my inspiration came from realizing that true language access already existed informally in the community, but not institutionally. And yes, there's lots of city and state laws, especially in New York, where you can request an interpreter in any language, even if the language that you speak has a smaller population size compared to other national languages represented in the city. But there were still major gaps for this community in terms of accessing those municipal services. And if people don't know that there are these interpreters available for them, or if they don't know how to request them, you may have language access compliance, but not necessarily effectiveness. So that begs the question then, are people being met where they actually live? Are public systems and local governments willing to recognize and partner with the informal infrastructure that communities have already built to support each other in their language, instead of treating language access as a matter of compliance or like a checkbox, as you said?
Yeah. And so it's interesting because it sounds like the community themselves were doing things on their own to become more accessible to their fellow Tibetans, and where actually language access is supposed to come from in the public arena, it wasn't really available. It wasn't thought for them. But I find this, is that right? Is that
Yeah,
statement
I think
what you observe?
yeah, the view of, part of my work is about critiquing views of diversity, and it was evident that certain languages, especially like smaller minoritized group languages, are visible only because those people are doing the work of making the language visible themselves. Um, Comparing those commercial spaces and businesses that are owned by speakers of minoritized languages to more like public institution type top-down spaces, and recognizing where there's mismatches between what the neighborhood is making visible, what people are doing like from a grassroots perspective versus what's coming from the city.
Yeah. And you mentioned, of course, the state has a lot of the burden on creating these regulations. And I've actually, New York is one of the ones that have many tools for language
Yes.
access. It lacks,
Yeah.
yeah, it lacks reach. But also another important thing, very important thing about what you're saying about this community in particular is that many other communities don't necessarily do that, right? They are not advocating for themselves, which in my opinion is a big challenge for um, defending language access rights, because sometimes the communities are not even aware that they have the right to language accessibility, which is a big challenge, and I've noticed it in other areas. So your research treats signs, scripts, and public texts as vital signs, which I found that interesting. And these vital signs that are part of community life. So for our listeners who are in the front line, like interpreters or social workers or other types of advocacy or advocates, how might paying attention to the linguistic landscape change the way they think about language access in their own cities?
So I think that paying attention to which languages are visible in public space is really important for seeing which groups are actually present in a city or a neighborhood beyond those who are showing up in official data. During my research, I found it surprisingly challenging to find population data on the Tibetan community, as far as like the population of the Tibetan speaking community in New York City, let alone Jackson Heights. Um, Official records like the census were not detailed enough. There were still instances where smaller minority groups are getting classified as, quote, other, or grouped in with larger nationalities and ethnicities. And this is notably problematic, I think, for the Tibetan community because they're a stateless people and many have refugee status or living in exile from Tibet. So
Mm-hmm.
these official methods of classification marginalize their distinct language background even further through erasure. So for interpreters and advocates, I think looking to the linguistic landscape is a gateway to reaching those, I guess, invisibilized populations and shifting
Yeah.
your perspective from top down to bottom up language access efforts. If you're walking down a commercial strip or a central hub like Diversity Plaza in Jackson Heights, look at what scripts are on storefronts and community bulletin boards. Then compare that to what languages are being made visible within municipal buildings, schools, hospitals, libraries, even subway stations like within the neighborhood. So I think if there's a mismatch there, that's going to be the clue.
Yes.
And I think it's also important to keep in mind if there's a certain language community that's present in the area but not showing up in interpretation usage data, that doesn't necessarily mean that that community doesn't need those services, right? It might mean that
Exactly.
it might mean that group doesn't feel safe requesting services in their language for some reason, maybe because of their immigration status, or maybe because they simply don't know, like you said before, that those
Right.
services are available. So in that way, I think examining the linguistic landscape can be a practical tool for anticipating the language access needs of a community.
I also think it's so frequent that we see. For example, today I was in the court in the city where I live right now, which is Baltimore City, the district. I'm sorry, the circuit court, and the signage there is not in any other language than English, and we have a large population of Spanish speakers. Yet this sign that was inquiring about court services and give us your opinion, and then the QR code was only in English. So I was like, okay, the court doesn't necessarily want to know about the services for limited English proficient persons because it's all in English. There is no signage in other languages, or not abundant at least. There are other courts in the same state that have signage in other languages, but I felt I found curious the fact that that big endeavor to do this survey about their services didn't include any other um, languages, and to find that it's more that you are going to find actually the type of signage that you should find in a public in a public setting, actually in a store, or where people do their business basically every day is. Yeah. So, okay. So all social workers and interpreters and language access advocates out there, pay attention to what's happening in your community in terms of, other types of information and signage around you that may not be reflected in the public services that you actually do. Like if you're an interpreter and you don't see your signs in other languages in the court or in the hospital, that's a big red flag. If you're seeing that around your community, all of these services are in other languages. So in your study, Tibetan signs and scripts are both religious and everyday um, kind of signs. So, what does this reveal about how language access must account for spiritual, cultural, and practical dimensions of people's lives, not just service delivery?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting part of my research, just seeing how the visibility and the visibility of Tibetan and the religious and cultural weight that it carries. And I think that can offer a window into how language access can be something truly meaningful for historically marginalized groups, and not just about reacting to like requests or translating paperwork. Um, One major takeaway that I had from my research was the visibility of Tibetan in Queens was not just about signaling, oh, we speak Tibetan in the store or restaurant and you can too, but about holding space for Tibetan history, struggles, and dreams, and Tibetan past, present, and future. So yeah, something that I learned during the course of my research is how Tibetan script is really inextricably tied to Tibetan Buddhism. And it's also a strong symbol of Tibetan identity and national aspirations. So there's an event hall at the Tibetan Community of New York and New Jersey Center, which is located in Woodside in Queens. And the name of the event hall is Punsok Deshe Hall in Tibetan. And this name was chosen by the Dalai Lama. And the phrase itself translates to the four happinesses. And this refers to a set of four virtues of Tibetan Buddhism. Also inside of the event hall, you go in the community center, you have a space that has a sign above its entryway that reads Gyalom Diki Tsering, Hall of Happiness. And this is written in both Tibetan and in English. And this specific referent refers to Diki Tsering, who is the mother of the Dalai Lama. And she's also referred to as Gyalom Chemo, or the Great Mother. So beneath these surface level instances of visibility of Tibetan script is a religious connotation that is really recognizable to Tibetans, and it reinforces bonds of culture and spirituality. So I think that overlap between language, culture, religiosity can tell us something profound, that language isn't just about a transactional exchange or communicating messages, but it can carry belief systems and collective memory. And that's especially pertinent, I think, for refugee communities whose language has been historically suppressed in their homeland. Even in more commercialized spaces like restaurants, there's this repeated imagery of the place name Lhasa, appearing in a restaurant name, followed by an image of Potala Palace, either on the sign or a mural of it inside of the restaurant. Lhasa refers to the Tibetan capital, and Potala Palace was once the seat of the Tibetan government and the residence of the Dalai Lama. So through the repetition of these motifs, the connection between language, history, religion, culture, they're all becoming reinforced. And in this way, I think there's a link to the Tibetan homeland that is being maintained. If language access is only focusing on service delivery, we miss out on that emotional and spiritual dimension that could exist too. And I think for the speakers of those languages, seeing your language in public before you make that request, whether that's in public signage or in announcements from your city council district, that can be really affirming.
This is really profound because obviously, when we think about language access, we think about effective communication and that transaction between a doctor and a patient, a court and or the judge and the limited English proficient person or the victim, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And really, language is, as you say, is way beyond that. It has this multi-sectionality or very aspects of the human experience, right? Its culture is power because, and we see the power aspect in the languages that are represented, right? Like
Mhm.
the message is like, we thought about you, but not about you, right? Like
Yeah.
we thought about the English speaker, but not about the Spanish speaker, the Tibetan speaker. And that's why you mentioned about invisibilizing or communities that have been invisibilized. So yes, I think to your point, language is so it is so important to the human experience, the whole human experience, religion, culture, power, and we're only by I think by addressing language access, we're only tackling the tip of the iceberg. Is where the physical well-being of the person um, is guaranteed by the state by giving language access, right? Is but that doesn't mean that language access should only be that, but at
Right.
least be that, right?
Yes, at the minimum.
Yeah. So that's very important that people understand all the impact of language, and even if we only um, experience that short interaction. Like as an interpreter, I only experience that the language barrier with the or I accompany a person experiencing the language barrier just at little points of their life when it matters a lot, right? Like I think that when you go to the hospital and your health is at stake, it's a pretty important event where you should
Yes.
absolutely should have language access, right? But it could go way beyond that. It could go into religious spaces. It could go like in many aspects of life. So this is fascinating, and I think it's very important that people get to this conclusion that it's way more than offering just this ramp of access. And so now tell me, you write about neoliberal discourses of diversity that treat languages and cultures as marketable assets, right? So how do those narratives shape which languages get interpretation, translation, or public signage, and which are left invisible?
Right. So I talk a lot about neoliberal discourses of diversity in my dissertation. And by that phrase, I'm referring to a version of diversity that's market friendly. The parts of multiculturalism that can be commodified and sold as like a tourist experience, like food, like languages on storefronts, attracting customers interested in goods from another country, cultural tourism in general. And these are environments where diversity is celebrated, but power, the foundation of power, remains uninterrogated and unthreatened. The dominance of English is unchallenged, as speakers of minoritized languages are still predominantly using their native languages within their home or with friends, but are pressured to assimilate to English in other contexts. Among other languages other than English. There's those that are framed as more economically valuable to invest in, whether that's for municipal language access or for businesses to reach global markets, usually Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, and the standard varieties of these languages specifically. They usually fall into this category first. But smaller languages, especially those languages that are spoken by refugees or indigenous languages, they get framed as too small to justify investment in structured language access initiatives. So in Jackson Heights, it may appear on the surface that diversity is celebrated simply because it's allowed to exist. But that doesn't mean that there is institutional support for speakers of smaller minoritized languages to feel empowered to speak their language outside of their own home and community. So part of my work is about challenging this idea that the mere existence of diversity implies vitality or equity. And without structural support, diversity can become more of an aesthetic rather than something transformative and empowering.
Yeah, so it's just like surface level kind of diversity, really, right?
Yes.
You know, what you're saying makes me think about what I'm researching right now on Latin America and how language access has. I mean, there are concerted efforts by certain countries to make some languages official or protect indigenous languages, and but it doesn't ever go beyond the what's written in the law, which is very unfortunate. It's like, yeah, we have these great laws. For example, Colombia has over 60 languages, indigenous languages. I had no idea we had that many languages. Neither I know that there are like, I mean, there is formal education on those languages or any meaningful offer by the government to the communities to continue practicing their language. And what I notice is that still the preference for just adapting and in Spanish is really what ends up happening. And in the US, I also observed that with immigrant communities that they don't after a while, maybe not the immigrant, but the first generation will just let go of their language heritage. I don't know exactly like if that happens consistently, but this is what I have observed because I'm an immigrant myself, but I have friends that have children and their children already don't speak Spanish. Some of the people I know they do teach their children to speak Spanish, but some don't. So it makes me think about this surface level diversity effort that really doesn't protect the linguistic diversity. And I don't know if you're aware of this latest executive order that was issued, the executive order 14224, right?
Yeah.
And I found that so curious because usually when you use or when you try to say this language is official, it has an intention to protect it. I'm like, English is in no danger of going anywhere. Why are we going? Why are we making this effort to say this? It sounds such a waste of energy. I don't know what you think about that, but
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you just brought that up because recently, like just yesterday, I was listening to the episode of this podcast where you had Michael Mule on, and I've been learning everything about the policy and, changes in federal policy from him and his webinars, and he's been doing a lot of great work, kind of educating the wider public, including me, about those issues. And it's hard because they're very confusing, and I learned a lot about like what an executive order does and doesn't do from him, and the, I guess, vagueness of some of these orders and like the guidance or lack of guidance, as I think there hasn't been official guidance like issued yet on how agencies should carry out the new executive order designating English as the official language. But yeah, I think, as far as, critiquing diversity, even if it seems like, you're looking at a city or a university where it's very welcoming and tries to brand itself as inclusive, it really does come down to those smaller languages where they're seen as, oh, you mean enough to be like included in our image of diversity and part of like seen as contributing to that image, but still small enough where we can kind of ignore or just not invest in supporting people in using that language in their daily lives. At different like public engagement.
To me, it's baffling how we, for a very long time, we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I always wonder what inclusion if we are consistently leaving at least 9% of the population out of any information, any sign, any service. What inclusion are we really talking about? Just to have a nice picture with a looking person? I mean, it doesn't. Yeah. It really doesn't. Give full meaning to the word diversity and much less to the word inclusion. And I really think inclusion is what matters the most. It's like, okay, it's nice that you have all these groups of people, but are they able to access the services that they need in a way that is understandable to them in a meaningful way? So yeah, it's just,
I think the equity part of that is just like dropped completely, honestly. I think there's still a lot of that happens between like people conflate equality and equity, I think. And I addressed that in some of your other questions, but equity and equality are different things. At least.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about that?
Yeah.
And how you see this in your research with the Tibetan invisibility that you found on the streetscape. Why don't we talk about that?
So yeah, definitely paying attention to invisibility, I think, is just as important as paying attention to visibility. And it's obviously harder to do the former, look for what's not there.
Exactly.
I think that that the invisibility is where more of the reality of language access for marginalized groups is revealed. And of course, you can't have a full picture of the situation if you only pay attention to invisibility or only pay attention to visibility. You need to look at both to understand where the gaps are occurring, where communities are saying, here's where we feel empowered to use our language, and here's where we're still encountering systemic barriers. On the visibility side of things, I think something I haven't mentioned yet is that in my research, I talked a lot about materiality and how permanent and how durable is signage in a certain language. And I think there's a lot to be said about looking at the materials that are used to make a sign. And it tells you a lot about the monetary investment that's placed into making a language visible and how long the sign is intended to be there. And one really illuminating example of this was COVID. And it was a time where we all had to do our part to keep ourselves and each other healthy and safe. And to do that, you need to reach the widest possible audience. There was a lot of information coming out very quickly. People were dying in very large numbers, and that information needed to be distributed as soon as possible to everyone. And in Diversity Plaza in Jackson Heights, like in the rest of the city, there were these makeshift tents that got set up where people could receive the COVID vaccine once it just started getting rolled out. And the signs that were affixed to these vaccine sites and the directional signs pointing people to the tents, they were some of the most multilingual signs in my data. In some cases, you had English, Bengali, Nepali, Spanish, and Tibetan all on the same sign. But these signs were also some of the most impermanent. And you could tell by looking at them that they were meant to be produced quickly, given the emergency and the urgent nature of the pandemic and the efforts to get as many people as possible vaccinated and tested. But once those pandemic restrictions eased and vaccination became more common, those signs were gone. And I compared this to the signs at the Tibetan Community Center of New York and New Jersey, where Tibetan signage has its own space, honestly, separate from English in some cases. And the materials that the signs were made of are of greater permanence and of greater durability. And that really cements that space as a place where Tibetan is the primary language of communication. So just because the multilingual COVID signs are gone doesn't mean that those groups stopped needing healthcare. I think despite,
Exactly.
yeah, I think the gravity of the situation, despite the gravity of the situation, that was a fleeting moment where we could see what language access that is designed with the specific community in mind truly looks like. And language access professionals can look to examples like that to advocate for greater community language visibility in hospitals and schools that takes into account the linguistic communities that have lived in the neighborhood for decades. This is something that can shift the perspective of linguistic diversity, I think, from this vibrant aesthetic to emerging from real people who need healthcare, who need childcare, who need court interpretation and civic engagement resources in their languages.
Yeah, and so if they were able to make the signage so quickly because of COVID, they can tackle the need. It's just is I think it's lack of will. And also the idea that it goes in one direction, but how are you hearing back what the community has to say to you? You know, there are tools to push out information, and you mentioned the perfect example, which was COVID.
Yeah.
But there are not tools to receive that information in other languages, or at least not something I have seen. And I also remember during COVID that there was like an effort through WhatsApp to tell you information about vaccines,
Yeah.
but originally there was only in English. And because I tried, I was like, I wonder if this is also in Spanish. And eventually, I guess they got there. But electronically speaking, there was not a lot of access, and also there are languages that don't use the written form. So I
Yes.
wonder what happened to them. Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to highlight there were efforts by the Endangered Language Alliance in the city during the pandemic to they've built a really great network of speakers of indigenous languages that live in the city, and they released a series of COVID health announcements, COVID like about the vaccine, about the disease, about how to get tested by speakers of indigenous languages, some of which don't have a writing system. And that was with the effort to circulate that information to people who are at like the furthest linguistic margins, and like who maybe have come from Spanish speaking countries but don't even speak Spanish. They're coming with their indigenous language, and it doesn't have a written form. So
No, right.
yeah.
And I see that perhaps I couldn't say frequently, but I've had cases where there is little understanding of the presence of indigenous languages in some countries, and just because they are from Latin America, then they assign a Spanish interpreter to the case,
Yeah.
just to find out that the person speaks Quiche or any other language. And yeah, that happened to me not too long ago, where um, a defendant spoke Quiche, but he also spoke enough Spanish to sort of made me think that he was a Spanish speaker. It wasn't until his actual hearing, and he said in good Spanish, but not good enough maybe to say I don't understand what the judge is saying, and I connected the dots. He's from Guatemala. His Spanish is not that great. Maybe he doesn't speak Spanish, and we we figure out that he spoke Quiche,
Mm.
but yeah, that is also an aspect of this linguistic diversity, that people don't know what languages are spoken in different countries, and also that some of the spoken languages are not even, you don't have like a written form. So how to communicate with them is it. There is so much to explore here. So your work also emphasizes that Tibetan language and script unite people across multiple ethnic backgrounds from the Indian subcontinent. How might this insight challenge monolithic one language equals one ethnicity, which was something we just talked about? How these assumptions in current language access planning and data collection?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really important question given that Tibetans are a stateless population. They don't fit into this idea of one language representing one nation. There are Tibetans in Jackson Heights who immigrated to New York from Tibet, but most people I spoke to were Tibetans who were born in India or Nepal and came from
Right.
there. So others still come from Bhutan and share the script. They share the Tibetan script with speakers of Dzongkha, which is the official language of Bhutan. And their lived experiences challenged this idea that one language maps neatly onto one ethnicity or one nation state or one census category, whatever. So my view of diversity in Jackson Heights that challenges this neoliberal monolingual nation state ideology is instead one of hybridity. And I try to bring attention to the fact that one language or script does not speak to one group, but many. And the Tibetan script is one that speaks to more than only the Tibetan community. There's another site that I visited during my research called the United Sherpa Association, which is in Elmhurst. And when you go there, you'll see that both Tibetan script and Devanagari script, they're both really visible and they're addressing multiple linguistic populations simultaneously. The Tibetan script is used to write the Sherpa language, and
Okay.
Devanagari is used to it's used for many languages. It's used for Hindi and Nepali.
Okay.
So it's not so easy to say in this space that an instance of Tibetan script is specifically speaking to Tibetans or in Sherpa and not Dzongkha or Tibetan, because Tibetans, Sherpas, Bhutanese, Nepalese people, they all visit and benefit from the cultural services that this center is offering. So the languages these groups speak sometimes have varying levels of mutual intelligibility in their written forms. So trying to identify a sign as purely one language or another is not only impossible, but it's deliberately ignoring this cross-cultural history and linguistic practices that these populations share. And I think language access planners can take away that even with a linguistic population like Tibetan, that seems relatively small compared to others in the city, that script is reaching people who speak languages that are even smaller. And maybe,
It's like a
yeah,
gateway script.
yeah.
Mm.
And maybe Tibetan even serves Tibetan, the spoken variety can serve as a common second language for Sherpa residents, as Nepali does for many Tibetan New Yorkers. When I asked my Tibetan interviewees what languages they speak, almost all of them said Nepali as well, alongside their other
Interesting.
languages. So I guess what I want to say to policymakers is don't be so quick to write off languages that seem too small, because that could be a language that is useful to more people than just the first ethnic group that comes to mind.
Interesting. By the way, what did you have to use interpreters for your research?
No, because I interviewed about 10 people during the course of my research, and they were all able to communicate in English. But they were fluent in like Tibetan, Nepali, some spoke Hindi, because they mostly came from India or Nepal to New York City.
And because people that speak like there are so many people that speak multiple languages, and that's something that we should strive for in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you know, it's incredible to me that we in the US don't not you don't find a lot of polyglots in the US as you do in India, for example. You
Yeah.
know, we should um we should learn more languages. More funding needs to go into
I can see
learning,
that.
right? Yeah. So at the beginning of like when I introduced you, I used a word most people don't know when I was describing your work, there is a word there that caught my attention: geosemiotics. Can you
Yeah.
tell our audience what that is? And given that it helps connect language, space, and power in Jackson Heights, how could a similar framework be used by city agencies and community organizations to design more equitable, community centered language access policies?
Yeah, it's definitely a fancy sounding word, very academic sounding. And it was developed by academics, which is why it refers to a framework that was developed by linguists Ron and Susie Scollin. And in layman's terms, what it refers to is how to understand the meaning of a sign through its placement in physical space and its geographical context.
Okay.
So, why are signs placed where they are? Who makes the sign? Who puts it up? Who chooses what languages are on a sign and vice versa? And how does the history and makeup of a location influence what languages are going to be present on a sign? Um,
Oh, interesting. Okay. So
yeah,
let's say an airport, like I always wonder at the airports, like who decided that this sign goes in here and
yeah,
why it is so perfect? And actually, I notice in different airports that have good signage because you always know where you are, whereas others you don't. But anyway, I thought maybe that's an example. Is that a good example of
it is. Another
geosemiotic?
example that the Scollins outline in their work is about a no smoking sign. So, say you're looking at a no smoking sign, and the text of the sign is written in simplified Chinese characters as opposed to traditional Chinese characters. That choice might be made because, well, that sign is located in mainland China, where that style is used. If the same sign were in Taiwan or in Hong Kong, then maybe the same sign would most likely be written using traditional Chinese characters instead. And the sign is not just a product of where it is located, but also the time it was made, because simplified Chinese characters were introduced after 1949, the Cultural Revolution in China. So geosemiotics means a sign is a product of the time it was produced and where it's intended to be placed. And
Oh, okay.
if you go to the Tibetan community of New York and New Jersey Center in Woodside, you'll see signs on the building written exclusively in Tibetan script. You'll find English signs in the building too, but something interesting that I saw there was that Tibetan and English were often written on separate signs rather than sharing space, like one coming after the other on the same sign. And I think that spoke to the effort to put Tibetan on equal footing with English, and it reflected the context of that space as a center meant to meet the needs of the Tibetan community in the Tibetan language. Tibetan was existing there in a really communicative manner outside of the consumerist gaze of the more commercial areas of Jackson Heights. So in that space, Tibetan is being prioritized because Tibetans are the population being served. But if you go to a public hospital or a government office in the same area, there's no Tibetan exterior signage. You might see Spanish and Mandarin. There was even Bengali script on some of the signs outside of Elmhurst Hospital, at least during my research, but not in Tibetan. So that absence, going back to the invisibility, is also meaningful. And it's certainly not missed by the linguistic community, who still needs a relative or a friend to translate for them at doctor's appointments.
Mhm.
So I think geosemiotics, while it sounds like this academic jargon, when you break it down, it's really a useful set of tools for reading that contrast, because it trains you to ask, why does Tibetan have authority over a storefront, but not at a public institution in the same neighborhood? And who decides what languages appear on permanent signs versus temporary ones? Going back to the multilingual COVID signs in Jackson Heights that included Tibetan, why can't there be permanently visible wayfinding signage, or readily accessible healthcare information, or guidance on how to request an interpreter in hospitals where there's a large Tibetan community? And also the question of, why are some languages centered as communicatively important to make visible in an institution, while others are neglected or relegated to commercial spaces or the domestic sphere?
Yeah, which also takes us back to what you were talking about a few minutes ago about how this diversity is only celebrated kind of in the surface level visually, right? And so, but a lot of the communities are still excluded
Right.
when we come into making a decision. So what would it look like for language access initiatives to move beyond that visibility alone and build genuine co-governance with speakers of minoritized languages, for example, all the indigenous languages existing in the US right now?
I think that shifting from the idea of language visibility in any form being a sufficient indicator of the vitality of that language, moving from that to building co-governance with minoritized language speakers. That's part of what it means to ensure meaningful, I'm putting this in quotes, meaningful language access, which I think is a phrase that gets kind of repeated a lot by language access advocates, because it's possible for a language to be highly visible and for the speakers to still be experiencing barriers in accessing the services English speakers take for granted, to still mostly be using their language with their family, friends, and neighbors, but feeling the pressure to shift to English in other contexts. And it's evident when you go to Jackson Heights and you walk down Roosevelt Avenue that there's a Tibetan community living there. You're going to see the language. But as I've been explaining, just seeing a language without understanding the context of its visibility and without understanding where the language remains invisible, it doesn't give you the full picture of to what degree people feel they can use their language in their daily lives. So I think true language justice for those minoritized linguistic groups would look like those communities helping shape policy and not just being on the receiving end of it. Oh, sorry.
No, it just, if I may say something about that,
Yeah.
this makes me think about the Super Bowl and how the decision to invite an artist from the United States that was going to sing in Spanish, and the commotion that it created. So it makes me think, okay, so when it comes to this cannot be necessarily called like co-leading something, but it's an approximation, right? Because it makes this artist participant on the artistic display at the Super Bowl. And at that point, then it became a big problem, right? So it's like it's fine to have all this music around, but once it is part of the main message or sort of the co-leading space, it becomes a huge problem. So I don't know if that's a good example, but it's one I can think of that just happened recently, 2 weeks ago maybe.
Yeah, I think, thinking about language access and language justice being two different concepts, language justice is really about challenging the English hegemony and involving limited English proficiency speakers or speakers of languages other than English into decision-making processes that ultimately affect them in the end. If language policy is being designed only by speakers of a dominant language without the feedback or the involvement of the people that policymakers envision as being on the receiving end of that, then that policy is not being informed by the lived experiences of people who know best about their daily lives, who are encountering barriers to services the most frequently. And even if that's unintentional, it creates the potential for exclusion based on one's competence in English. I want to uplift one small scale model of what I thought was really great, kind of a step towards language justice, was a digital flyer that was created by City Councilwoman Julie Wan's office, who her district represents an area of Queens that has a sizable Tibetan population. And speakers of lots of other languages as well. It's a part of Queens, so you're gonna have a multilingual neighborhood at somewhere. And her office has really recognized that this population makes up a good chunk of their constituency. And they created flyers in Tibetan about a city planning town hall that was happening in the district that was going to affect all the residents. So a link was even made available to register for the town hall in Tibetan. Before you even get to the meeting and request an interpreter, you can sign up in Tibetan to participate in this town hall.
Wow.
And the interpretation services were being provided at the town hall in Tibetan and in several other languages. So I think those practices, they represent a step towards co-governance in service of language justice, because the district, they proactively invited Tibetan residents into civic decision-making spaces, and they broke down the barrier of English competence by providing access in Tibetan at multiple stages.
Exactly.
Advertising the town hall, to registering for it, to participating in it. So language access that's aimed towards the goal of language justice is about that proactive anticipation of allowing the most voices possible into a decision-making space by building in multilingualism before interpretation is even requested. It's about sharing,
Exactly.
it's about sharing that decision-making power with everyone who lives in a community, and recognizing that minoritized language speakers are not just some group that you need to accommodate. They're real residents, they're taxpayers, they're organizers, and most importantly, they're experts in their own lived realities.
Oh man, that's so important because the fact that you are creating something with the people that are multilingual in mind, right? Already before you ever even get to the need, as you say, of an interpreter or a translator, it really shows that you are building a system with everybody in mind, not
Right.
just let's create the system and then let's accommodate, as you say, others. I love that concept. And so it seems like this community is very special in the way they had agency. So what can we learn from the group of Tibetans, or how do Tibetan owned and Tibetan frequent spaces, specifically in Jackson Heights, how does that function as grassroots language access infrastructures, and what can we learn as institutions or people from these bottom-up practices?
So Tibetan-owned spaces, they already function as informal language access hubs by virtue of being spaces where Tibetan community members can gather and support each other in their language. And at the various Tibetan community centers that are in Queens, language is a way to signal those places as part of the support system for Tibetans. It's calling out to the community, and it marks these buildings as places that will serve them in some way, whether that's with filling out paperwork or offering Tibetan language classes to their children, or in specifically the Tibetan context, navigating how to receive something called the Green Book, which functions kind of like a passport for exiled Tibetans to claim benefits and rights from the Central Tibetan Administration. So bottom-up infrastructures like that are built from trust. And I think institutions can really learn from that, because they don't need to reinvent the wheel. They don't need to reinvent outreach models. They can partner with these trusted community members and organizations who already have credibility and linguistic competence. So recognizing a community you serve, not just as people that you're accommodating, but people you should be learning from and partnering with, is really important, I think, for building equitable language access infrastructure.
Yes, equitable. Do you want to say something about the difference between equitable versus equal?
Yeah, I mean, in short, I think equality, I think of like, well, the laissez-faire kind of characteristic of language policy, or like compared to other countries, like lack of regulation of like, this language is not like, only these languages can be here. And if you have a language visible in public space, it must be in this order. Like there's nothing strict like that in New York City, nothing like policy based that's regulating that. There's space for all the languages to, share space with one another. But equity, I think, is speaking to who is receiving the most structural support, who is receiving the most, I guess, resources, and whose language is being kind of lifted up the most by top-down infrastructure, and whose needs are like being addressed based on other factors beyond just like population size, like refugee status or recency of immigration to the United States, and realizing that there's more that you need to look at beyond just what's the biggest language population size, because that's not the only indicator of need, and vulnerability is not going to be like, that's not going to be an accurate indicator of vulnerability, I think, if you just base things on these are the top 10 biggest languages, and we're going to prioritize how we structure our language access initiatives based on these top 10.
Yeah, because that was another question I had. Is like
Yeah,
many language access efforts prioritize excuse me, big languages with large numbers of speakers like Spanish, Mandarin, Russian, and so I wonder what does focusing on Tibetan in Jackson Heights teach us about the ethical and political importance of supporting numerically smaller but highly vulnerable language communities.
yeah.
And yeah, you answered a little bit to that. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
It's yeah. So getting more into about, population size is not the only indicator of need,
Yeah,
and newer immigrant groups will likely have higher proportions of LEP speakers and people who are going to need more support accessing government services. So if we only prioritize resources based on the largest language groups, we're reinforcing that inequity. My work with the Tibetan community showed that histories of marginalization and risk, taking those into account, is really relevant to ensuring meaningful language access. And putting effort into supporting these smaller languages affirms that every community deserves dignity, not just the ones that are statistically significant. Um, I think it urges people doing language access work in any sector to
excuse
be
me.
more conscious of the localities that they're serving, the neighborhood languages that are being spoken, and like with the city council district town hall that I mentioned earlier, ensuring that limited English proficiency individuals have access and opportunity for engagement in public initiatives at every step of the way.
Right, there from the get-go. I'll give you a small example of my time working at a hospital where they built a new tower. It was a fancy tower. It was one of the most modern hospitals and one of the best also, at least back when I used to work there. And like in any project, and this I learned from my training as a project management professional, you are supposed to involve all the stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
But when they designed the hospital and the hospital rooms, they didn't include our department, the language access services department. As a result of that, when the hospital was finished, they were no phone jacks for the types of phone that we need to do the interpretation. And this was years ago. Now you don't use that, you use computers and all that. But it was such a shame that it wasn't included from the beginning. It could have saved us a big headache because it was a headache then to have this fancy
Sure.
hospital. But then when you need to interpret with the two can talk phones, I remember that was the name, we couldn't connect them. It was a little ridiculous. It was like we have a large community that didn't speak English. In fact, we had a whole department in that at the hospital, yet they didn't make them a stakeholder.
Yeah.
So this your work is fascinating, and I really feel privileged that we get to talk about this. It's wonderful to see like-minded individuals that are thinking about through inclusion. And I want you to tell our listeners where can we learn more about your work, and anything that you want to say that might help them find you or know more about your work and how they can learn and implement things for their own
Yeah.
businesses and organizations.
I think right now my LinkedIn page is the most up to date on all the work I've done so far. Um, you can find it under my name, Olivia Mignone. Um,
Yes.
it's my dissertation is linked on my profile. It's freely accessible and downloadable. It's called Vital Signs, Tibetan in the Linguistic Landscape of Jackson Heights. Also on my LinkedIn, I have two data visualization projects that I did recently. There are two interactive dashboards and maps that I created using one using Tableau and one using the programming language R. And these are maps visualizing the limited English proficiency populations across New York City. And they're meant to make language access needs more visible and more actionable. And one of them visualizes limited English proficiency in New York City based on percentages. So, what proportion of the population of a community district is limited English proficiency, as opposed to looking at population totals. So this was in an effort to get insight into which community districts might be facing the greatest need for language access resources.
I wonder if we can show because this is also showing in YouTube. I wonder if you can show the map, which I found fascinating, and I was wondering how can we actually use this type of tool to identify linguistic diversity in other countries. Is it possible for us to show how it works? Let me
Yeah,
see.
of course. Let me try. Okay, so here's one of them. I'll share my screen if I'm able to do
I
that.
think you can.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, okay, can
Okay,
you see this?
I can see,
Yes.
yes.
So this is available on Tableau Public. If you search my name, Olivia Mignone, it should come up. It's called Limited English Proficiency LEP Population of New York City. And I made this using, this is publicly available data, by the way. I want to shout out New York City Open Data. There's the link to the original data source is linked at the bottom, population and languages of the limited English proficient speakers by community district. So when you open the dashboard initially, it'll be all of the, basically the entire LEP population of New York City shaded by community districts. So things that are shaded in darker red are going to be,
The most
um,
populous.
yeah, the highest population. So the other, I'll show the other one in a bit, but this is basically just on population size. And
Huh?
it'll give you the community district name and the borough community district code. But what you can also do is if you click on the drop down filter, you'll see these are all the languages that were included in the data set.
Yeah.
And what you can do is say you want to look at, let's do Tibetan. Tibetan is here. You filter it by Tibetan. And now you're viewing which community districts have the highest LEP Tibetan speaking population. And you can see data on that as you hover over the different community districts. And on the left-hand side, you'll get a bar graph representation of the same data. So you can
Wow, this
basically,
is fascinating. And you say
oh,
this is all information that's publicly available and you use
yes.
this tool.
Yeah, so if you go to the link that's in the map, you'll go to the table that I use to create this data set. Like you can use it to make your own data. It's open access.
Nice.
So
I may use it.
yeah, absolutely. And then the other, I mean, do you have any other questions about the way that this?
Oh, no, no, I wanted people to see how they can access that information that you produce in your research. So it's all publicly available. We are going to drop the links when we release the podcast. Um, but is there anything I failed to ask that you would like for me to ask you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I guess, well, what I want to emphasize is, and then I kind of wanted to show the other map based on this
Ah,
question, but I've been trying to kind of explore what the landscape of language access might look like if we approach it from a proportion sort of perspective, rather than raw population size, because
mm,
I think that, you know, with the Tibetan population, they aren't one of the top 10 biggest in the city, but over half of the population is classified as limited English proficiency. So this map, this is a interactive map that I made using R. It's available on rpubs.com, again, by searching for my name. It's called Visualizing LEP Concentration by Community District. So this takes a different approach. And this whole part, I mean, you could skip this. This is about how I actually ran the code to do the project, but the actual map is at the bottom. And it's kind of the same layout. So it's based on community districts in New York City. But instead, now the shading is showing you which districts have the highest proportion of limited English proficiency speakers. So if you click on one of these, it'll give you, okay, here's the name of the district, the total population of the district, total LEP population, and then the percentage. So basically dividing those two numbers. So you're going to get slightly different information here because now we're going off of percentages rather than the size of the total LEP population. And I think that is an indicator of communities that might have the greatest need, especially as new immigrant and refugee populations come into the city. This data kind of reflects, okay, where are they settling? It's adding to the LEP population of a particular community district. And I think what I would love to see is an effort to make this something I can turn into where now you can filter it by language.
Yes. And also, sorry, I think this is very useful for language access advocates, people that are designing language access plans, right? Something like this would be useful.
Yeah, so that's kind of one goal of mine in the future, is to see like efforts to collect that kind of data where we can have a more detailed version of something like this and identify percentages of limited English proficient individuals within a specific language category, language group rather. I think that is a really useful step to take towards shifting from an approach that might make administrative sense, like ranking things based on total population size, but could still end up missing communities that have high proportions of limited English proficient individuals.
Right. So this tool could be used not only by language access planners or language access coordinators, but companies that provide language services could also benefit from this kind of information, especially if they want to change culture around language accessibility. So I encourage everybody to do that. Well, as we close this conversation, I want to bring us back to what Olivia has invited us to do, to treat our streets, our institutions, and our everyday environments as texts that reveal whose languages are welcomed and whose are pushed to the margins. By critiquing neoliberal diversity narratives that commodify culture without meeting communities' concrete linguistic needs, her research offers an evidence base for recentering language access on rights, safety, and participation. For language access advocates, social workers, interpreters, language services providers, this perspective helps connect everyday struggles, like a lack of signage in certain languages or the erasure of refugee languages in multicultural branding, to broader policy structures that can be challenged and redesigned. Our hope is that this episode doesn't just inform you, but equips you to look differently at the spaces you move through, to ask harder questions of the systems you work in, and to join us in building a culture of language access that is rooted in dignity, accountability, and shared power. Thank you so much, Olivia. It was really a pleasure. And I learned a lot just by interviewing you and reading about your work. Thank you so much for sharing with everybody.
Thank you, Carol. I'm honored to have been a guest on your podcast. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, my pleasure.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.